once that wooden wheel starts rolling down the hill, you don't know. It can wobble and fall over at any time, but on the other hand, it can keep rolling for an unbelievably long period of time. Seemingly impossible. Seemingly in defiance of the laws of physics, but in fact, in perfect conformity to the laws of physics. That's what you're looking at with every wobble of the wheel, and on some level you know it. The people in the streets of Iran who are complaining that the cost of living is too high, in some cases the cost of food, those people are not fighting for a future in which prostitution is legal, tolerated, and ubiquitous. They're not fighting for the sexual liberation of women and gay men. They are not fighting for a future in which Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is coercively taught to the masses and accepted by the masses. You cannot exaggerate the significance of the sexual component of this problem. All political organization is in principle sexual. What we're talking about here is not symbolically sexual, like a dildo. It is actually sexual, like a bird's nest. The bird's nest is the actual bridge between generations. When we organize politically, whether that's part of a status quo regime or it's a revolutionary civil war, we are building the bird's nest. When we build the institutions, schools, hospitals, when we build roads, the roads that we scatter across the landscape are so many twigs in this bird's nest. We are building the society for our children and grandchildren to live in. We are creating the conditions that will allow us to sexually reproduce. And from the perspective of conservative Muslims, when they are repressing homosexuality, when they are repressing prostitution, making prostitution illegal, making it invisible, but possibly putting people in prison, possibly executing people, what have you, From their perspective, they are likewise building that bird's nest. They are building the bridge between generations. All political organization is sexual in principle. Political philosophy is erotic, period. We do this for our children and grandchildren. We don't do it for ourselves. That's why it's political. Iran, to follow a sleepwalker in search of an awakening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a podcast called Doomed Republic. You may be hearing the recording on a YouTube channel called à-bas-le-ciel or elsewhere. If you click around through the description, you're going to find that this is part of a cycle of podcasts, of a web ring of podcasts called AR&IO, Active Research and Informed Opinion. Lifelong ignorance and the culture of commentary. Isn't it peculiar how everyone just a few days ago suddenly was an expert on Venezuela? And now, just as suddenly, these same people are experts on Iran. The history and politics of Iran is not easy to develop specialized expertise in. These languages are not easily learned. I come out of a background of being a scholar of Buddhism, ancient, modern, and medieval, dealing with like politics of the 20th century, like Buddhism during the Vietnam War, Buddhism during World War II, Buddhism in response to the invention of the atom bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Buddhism in the modern world, Buddhism and cult studies, Buddhism and the Beatles, Buddhism and the Rolling Stones. I come out of a background of scrutinizing credentialed academics, PhD-wielding academics who hadn't read the books they pretended to read, who couldn't understand the languages they claimed to understand. But those academics had many years to put on the mask, to practice the song and dance for an audience of unsophisticated teenagers. And then all of a sudden, they're sitting across the desk from someone like me. And let's face it, there's no one else like me. It's just me. They're sitting down at a desk with me. And they have to deal with real skepticism, real cross-examination of what they know and how they know it. The people who pretend to be experts in the history and politics of Iran, just as suddenly as they developed expertise in the history and politics of Venezuela, I do not hear them reflecting on what they have read. Like, they don't even pause to say, oh yeah, I remember a couple of years ago I read this book and it really changed the way I perceive this. They certainly do not talk about gaining the language or living amongst the people. Let me remind you of a phrase that actually begins with Russian nihilism, but comes close to 21st century cultural anthropology: the praxis of anthropology as a social science. Go to the people, be the people. Now, let me remind you, I never became fluent in the Lao language. I never gained the ability to read the Lao translation of Karl Marx. It's one of the very few books that was really translated at a very, very high level of quality. They had a communist regime. They were especially linked to East Germany as Schwesternationen. They were sister countries, but of course also to Russia. In a later period, they started cooperating with China, but communist China was their great enemy for many years. They were in this alliance with the Russians and the East Germans and the Soviet bloc. Okay, I never got to the level of ability in the Lao language to be able to read Marx. I also couldn't give a lecture on Buddhist philosophy. Why do I know so much about Lao politics, Lao history, Lao culture? Well, partly because I went there and I really lived amongst the people. Now, I admit, I was reading Shakespeare and John Dryden when I was out there living amongst the people. I had a lot of time on my hands. I was sleeping under a mosquito net. I wake up in the morning and chop firewood. I was studying ancient Buddhism. I was studying modern Buddhism, but in my own time, I was still reading in English. As it happens, that's the first time I read the poetry of Dryden, who's kind of a competitor to Shakespeare in terms of how the history of English literature is remembered. I'm not saying they were competing while they were alive, but they're competing for their place at the top of the top 10 list of greatest English literary figures. I remained a snob. I remained a sober, atheist, vegan outsider to their culture. I didn't drink their liquor. I didn't dance at their weddings. I didn't engage in participant observation in the anthropological sense. Nevertheless, I have a level of engagement with Lao politics, history, and culture above and beyond the mere reading of books. And let's face it, most of what I know nevertheless comes from books. And I can tell you on any given issue, if you challenge me about the politics of Laos, how do you know that? I have an answer. And it may be a combination of those sources of knowledge I just mentioned. And it may be that I'm wrong. It may be you're about to tell me I'm mistaken or I've been misled by the sources I rely on, and I'm about to gain a whole new perspective. And that's great. I mean, look, I am not humble. I'm not preaching humility. I'm trying to delineate the difference between the bullshit artistry that passes for political science expertise in our times and true, earnest engagement with these issues. Who among us today can say they know anything about politics in Iran? Who among us today can say they know anything about politics in Venezuela? And that knowing may amount to mere caring that will lead you into this kind of research in the future. Maybe right now, today, you don't know that much about Iran or Venezuela, but you just bought a book. You just started reading a book. Say that. Share with me your struggle. With any of these areas of research, you have to study the language. You have to. Maybe that's a tragedy. I mean, I never boast about my own background in terms of studying these languages. Instead, I talk about these things in a very warning and warding way. I tell people, look, if you can possibly avoid this, you should avoid it. Learning a language comes at a price. It's a terrible, terrible cost. The years of your life you're going to sacrifice just to get a smattering of familiarity with a language like Chinese, and the kind of disappointment and heartbreak you may be setting yourself up for if you commit to learning the Chinese language. This is what happened to me in brief, without digressing into my autobiography. Okay, well, isn't it a strange thing that neither in the highly individualistic and individualized theater of YouTube, nor in the highly professionalized theater of broadcast television, old school mainstream media, do we find examples of people who made this kind of sacrifice, who made this kind of commitment to learn these languages and to develop real expertise in this history? Why is it that our coverage of all of these political issues is so appallingly shallow? I remember when the war in Afghanistan first started. I remember when the war in Iraq first started. So you guys know which war I mean. Some of you will say, hey, which war are we talking about here, bro? Yeah, I admit, there's been more than one war in Iraq. There's been more than one war in Afghanistan. The forever wars I'm talking about here. When the United States began bombing and invading these countries, basically in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, that's the period of time I'm talking about, the voices on the news were appallingly shallow, appallingly poorly informed. And in those days, the news would try to have kind of one person representing the left, one person representing the right, or one person who is pro-war and one person who is anti-war. They'd try to have two conflicting perspectives, but they would both be equally ignorant in the sense I'm talking about. They would have, equally little commitment to these causes, to these chapters of history, to the study of these languages, so on and so forth. And I remember thinking, well, it's a brand new war. Within the next couple of years, right, this will improve. Within the next couple of years, we're going to start to get people with real profound expertise in Afghanistan and its peoples and languages on the news during doing this role. We're going to start to see men on camera who really committed years of their lives to the study of these languages and culture, and who really understand what's going on. Why? And that never happened. Instead, the public and the professionals engaged in producing this kind of infotainment became increasingly comfortable with, increasingly self-confident in, presenting this kind of podunk, ignorant perspective again, again, and again. We all became accustomed to Christopher Hitchens presenting his opinion about Baghdad, about what was happening in the streets of Baghdad. I'm sorry, some of you hear the name Christopher Hitchens and you don't know what I'm talking about. Some of you hear the name Christopher Hitchens and you associate him with some YouTube videos about atheism, and you in a different sense, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you were alive at the time, Christopher Hitchens was a regular, weekly proponent of the war, appearing on mainstream television, mainstream broadcast media. I'm sure he also made radio appearances. I'm sure he also wrote columns in newspapers. Whether Christopher Hitchens should be described as left or right, left of center, right of center, it is baffling and difficult to come to any conclusion about. Christopher Hitchens at that time was primarily famous for his criticism of Mother Teresa, his criticism of a prominent Catholic religious leader, and he made this transition into being a professional proponent of the war. What does Christopher Hitchens know about Iraq? What does Christopher Hitchens know about Baghdad? What does he know about Kabul or Afghanistan, we may ask also? This was not a transitional period of going from ignorance to the presentation of real expertise. Instead, this kind of ossified the culture of commentary in our times. Like everyone, again, both the professionals producing this kind of show and people in the audience, everyone became accustomed to receiving the supposedly expert opinion of people like Christopher Hitchens, including and especially Christopher Hitchens himself. This is what we were supposed to regard as erudite commentary. Obviously, the vast majority of people who started playing the game in that period did not become as famous as Christopher Hitchens. But of course, some have become more famous than Christopher Hitchens, more politically powerful, including Tucker Carlson. That is precisely the period of time that created Tucker Carlson as we now know him. You guys may not remember this. He was wearing a bow tie back in those days, and he made a very difficult transition. He really wanted to keep the bow tie as his personal signature to just wearing a collared shirt with no tie at all. But anyway, Christopher Hitchens and Tucker Carlson, they were prominent experts. What expertise did he have? What did Tucker Carlson know about Iraq, Afghanistan, or any of America's ongoing wars at that time? He was on television again week after week after week. Now, I will actually say one sort of kind thing about Tucker Carlson, whom I obviously regard. I regard him as an imbecile. I mean, he's an incredibly stupid, incredibly immoral person. But to say something kind, today he openly laments that period of his life. He says with great passion that it's one of the greatest regrets of his life. He looks back on that and feels heartbroken. What it was he said in support of the war in Iraq, what it was he said in support of Afghanistan. I've seen him refer to himself as someone who was a warmonger in that period. He looks back at that time in his life and he says that he was wrong. Now, he means that he was morally wrong. He doesn't really talk about being factually wrong. He doesn't talk about the fact that he never sat down and opened up the textbook and started memorizing verbal conjugations. This is the most painful thing with every new language. Started memorizing the names of the days of the week, the names of the months. Oh, there's so much vocabulary to learn, which is of no real political or philosophical interest. Oh, and I've done it for so many languages, and I'm looking at doing it with yet more languages now again. He doesn't look back and say, hey, I was the wrong guy for this job. And despite the fact that he had many years and many millions of dollars, I mean, to my knowledge, he's now a very, very wealthy person, but he was certainly well paid at the time. He certainly had the money to hire a private tutor. He did not take that as an opportunity to develop the expertise necessary. When those wars first began, maybe Christopher Hitchens knows nothing, maybe Tucker Carlson knows nothing. But why is it that 5 years later, they're both still as ignorant as they were 5 years before, having made an industry out of their own opinions? Why didn't they ever become experts if they had this passion, if they had this motivation? So this is why I titled this section Lifelong Ignorance and the Culture of Commentary. This is a trap I've been very careful to avoid myself. You can fall into a cycle of presenting your opinion week after week or day after day, whether that's independently on YouTube, independently in a podcast, independently broadcasting your voice, your face on the internet, or it's, working for a broadcasting agency, shall we say. It's working for a television station, a radio station, or what have you. It's very easy, it's very beguiling to think, it's my opinion, it's my perspective that matters. The majority of people are very eager to believe that there's something special about me, right? And the reality is that no, that position you put yourself in was an opportunity for you to learn. But that learning has to begin with a kind of humility, a kind of recognition of your own ignorance. When I, first started studying the politics of Laos, I couldn't pronounce the name of the prime minister. I couldn't remember or pronounce the names of the communist revolutionaries who had created that system. Now, naturally, let me just add, it's something the Chinese love to joke about. If you grow up with Chinese as your first language, it's even harder to pronounce names from Laos and Thailand. They have these long names that are generally etymologically connected to Pali. Pali is the ancient language for Buddhist philosophy, or Sanskrit, associated with Hinduism, or both. Sometimes you get a mixture of the two, right? Sometimes you get some other language or dialect creeping in there, make things really fun. And, I'll always remember this. There was a big fat guy working for the Communist Party. So he was I could call him a journalist. I could call him a Communist Party apparatchik. He was both. And anyone who was actually in Laos in that decade would know this guy. There weren't that many big fat guys working for the communist government. He had very gregarious personality, and he was at every important political event in the country. Anyway, there was this big guy who had one of these incredibly long, difficult to pronounce names. And he said to me honestly, "You are the first person who can pronounce my whole name." And I said, "What, do you mean the first white person? Like, do you mean the first American?" I'm Canadian, but of course he perceived me as American. Well, what do you mean? And he said, "No. The native people here who speak Lao as their first language, they can't pronounce it either." And he actually brought me around and introduced me to other Communist Party apparatchiks. It's a communist country. A huge percentage of the population are employed by the Communist Party. And he in front of a group of people, said, "Here, listen to this. Here, pronounce my name." And I pronounced his whole name. And they all stood there and said, "Whoa, this is their first language." And for me, I don't even know. It's not even my second language, but it's a language I'm struggling to study, right? Anyway, by the way, I gave myself a name in their language, which was culturally appropriate, and they were all blown away by it. They're like, "Oh, wow." They could tell that I'd really studied the history and politics just from this name I chose, and they laughed about that too. They go, "All the other foreigners choose these names that don't make any sense, but you chose this name that shows you kind of get it." They laughed about that a lot. And this is not just mentioned, this is not brief laughter. I was an ignorant kid who grew up in Toronto. My education was worthless, and obviously what little I was told about the Vietnam War, it was just propaganda. It was false and misleading, intentionally misleading. What little I knew about Cambodia, what came from comic books, you know very little about Vietnam. You know even less about Cambodia. You know nothing at all about Laos. Growing up, primary school, high school, university. Obviously, I know nothing about these languages, but I had the opportunity. I did the work. And within like 2 years, it really was not a long time. It really wasn't. I started to gain some kind of profound appreciation for these people, their history, their politics. And yes, the study of the language is crucial to that. It is inextricable from that. And I'll be honest with you, I think in the 21st century, this has gotten worse, not better, because I will not digress into a long monologue about this. I'm tempted to. But basically, there is no longer any money to be made in translating political documents or politically significant sources into English from these other languages. So even with Venezuela, you might think, translating Spanish into English is easy. But today, like within the last 20 years, there's no money to be made out of translating the materials from Spanish into English and publishing them. As recently as the 1980s, there was money in that kind of work. I remind you, I have a background working in the nonfiction publishing industry. That little bit of money really mattered. There was a time when you could make a little bit of money gathering together like official statements from the communist government of Laos, translating them from Lao into English and publishing a volume, some kind of analysis of these primary source texts, and then presenting the primary source text. There was a time when the publishing industry rewarded a certain kind of scholarship and rendering primary source texts in English. Now that has disappeared. The primary source documents themselves, so the documents from Venezuela in Spanish, the original documents, those are now available through the internet as a PDF, digitized source, one way or the other. The government documents from a country like Laos, country like Cambodia, those are available in their original language on the internet. Even Japan, I'm just saying, the availability of that stuff now is much greater than it was in the 1980s, but you have to deal with the original language. So, I'm just being real with you. I am extremely skeptical about how much you can know about Iran if you do not work with the language. If you're very wealthy and you actually employ a staff, you could have a team of translators living in your apartment with you. For whatever reason, human nature doesn't seem to work that way. Topic for another monologue. It's very sad, it's very strange, but today, people only work with translators if they're in love with them, if they're married to them. Once in a while, you meet a gay couple that works that way. More often than not, it's a husband and wife team. But for whatever reason, in this century, people do not seem to work well with translators. Nothing less than love is required for two people to work together in translating these kinds of texts. And, polyamory, it doesn't have to be two people. Could be three people, could be four people. The 19th century phenomenon of, just having a team of 15 or 20 people working together on a translation project, that seems to have disappeared. Perhaps it relied on a kind of monasticism that we've all lost the taste for. But yeah, sure. You could have 4 translators sharing an apartment. It's not impossible. But we all know none of these commentators have that kind of staff behind them. None of them have that kind of motivation or passion behind them. It is not the case that any of these voices you hear on YouTube, any of these voices you hear on podcasts, or, on the other hand, professional media, have translators sitting together, working together, going through primary source political documents, really studying and learning from the history as it unfolds. There is no such engagement. Instead, what we are seeing are the consequences of this cycle, this commitment to lifelong ignorance while making money out of the culture of commentary. I'm going to quote a source out of context here. The very people our civilization should save, it destroys. Someone like Tucker Carlson, he's the most privileged person in the world. Tucker Carlson really does have the opportunity to become an expert in Venezuela, to become an expert in Iran. He has a kind of opportunity that most career academics with PhDs would be envious of. Now, let me just add, when I was in Laos doing my own research and learning the language and studying the history of politics, every single person with a PhD I talked to directly said to me that they envied me, that they were jealous of me. Maybe I could stop and reflect if there was a single exception to that. Did I ever talk to someone with a PhD who said the opposite, who said that they were happy that they had a PhD? No. I mean, their perspective was they had lost years of their life doing totally meaningless drudgery, denigrating terrible work that they resented and that they learned nothing from. And they were now stuck babysitting ignorant teenagers, going to staff meetings, the horrible grind of earning their income in academia. And then once every few years, they got to make a research trip that only lasted for a few days. Some of them were married to a native speaker of the language they wanted to study. Same pattern I mentioned before. They married into their area of expertise. But with those people aside, they'd often say that they had no time to study the language. They had no time to even do any reading of their own. Many of these people admitted, and in other cases they didn't admit this, but you could see the truth of it. They had learned nothing since their early days as a student. You know, they had this early period of really learning a lot and reading a lot, and then they're trapped in a cycle where they can't learn much of anything at all. They're recycling the same few things they learned at the start of their career. So anyway, whether we sympathize with this or not, whatever your perspective on it may be, someone like someone who is a professional commentator, doesn't matter if it's YouTube or CNN, it doesn't matter. Someone who is a professional commentator is in a uniquely privileged position to become an expert in any of these fields. And yet that very opportunity and the squandering of it destroys them. That's what you're looking at. That's what you're seeing. That's what you're hearing with this kind of so-called expert commentary. You're hearing the sort of intellectual ruination and ethical hollowness of someone who squandered an opportunity far greater than being in a PhD program. Now, I've got to tell you, I'm a mean old man now. This is recorded on January 20th, 2026. I never wake up and wish that I had gone into a PhD program. At this stage of my life, I am so happy I did not go through that. But, decades ago, there was a time when I thought, hey, this is a positive opportunity for me too. And I am now so happy I did not get stuck in that trap of producing new political commentary for my listeners week after week or day after day. I was not cursed with commercial success. And then very often, I just want to say, the choice you make becomes, am I going to broadcast nothing this week? Am I going to upload nothing this week so that I have the time to read this book and take notes and underline things and copy quotations? And then maybe 2 weeks later, I'm going to present a video on this. Let's say it's about the revolution in Iran, or let's say it's about Venezuela. They're both good examples right now. But 2 weeks later, it will be too late. I won't even get 10% of the audience I would have gotten if I uploaded a video that day, when people are searching for this, when people are clicking on this, when people want to know, right? So, like, you see the tension there. I think it's even stronger for independent commentarial voices. Like, if you're just doing your own thing on YouTube, there's this pressure on you to present, your expert opinion immediately. 2 weeks later will be too late, when maybe what you really need to do for your own good and for your audience's benefit is to take 2 weeks to read that one book. Whether you have another full-time job or you're raising kids or both, the number of hours the day you have for reading, the number of hours a day you have for original learning is finite indeed. And that's one of the reasons why I really warn people against playing video games. It's one of the reasons why I really warn people against owning a dog and walking a dog. It's bad for the dog, but it's bad for you too, right? Like the few hours you had to really develop as an intellectual, they were lost while you were out walking this dog, so on and so forth. You have to really face up to that. You have to face up to the fact that you had a limited opportunity to get this kind of reading done, get this learning done. And again, that's why it may take 2 weeks, but it may be that there's some other kind of profound reflection you got to do. It may be that you read this book and then you take the time to do comparative analysis of contrasting sources. You don't just read one book. You rapidly take a glance at what the other side of the argument says, point by point or chapter by chapter. You really try to develop a sophisticated opinion about this topic. I think 2 weeks is a reasonable estimate for how much work that's going to take. Someone like Cenk Uygur doesn't do that work. So Cenk Uygur, more than 15 years deep into his career as a commentator, obviously someone like Tucker Carlson doesn't do that work. And just reiterate my earlier hypothesis, this has been normalizing. This kind of self-righteous ignorance has become normal. I would say since September 11th, 2001, I've already sort of described this timeline, we have all become accustomed to people who really know nothing about Afghanistan and Iraq presenting their opinions again and again and again as part of the drumbeat of war or part of the sort of drumbeat of the protests clamoring for peace. There's just no expectation that these people truly are experts, nor that they develop expertise during the years in which, again, they are really kind of provided with this opportunity by the remuneration for their commentary. If you think Ben Shapiro has no time to do research, the average schlub with a PhD, it's pathetic how little time they've got. And they'll tell you. Look, that's my experience. I mean, maybe I'm an unusual person. Why are people so honest with me? Topic for another podcast. But let me tell you, the average person with a PhD, in my experience, is very eager to explain to you how little time they have for reading, for research, for the study of the language, for professional development, or to actually visit these countries, spend time in these countries that they may have devoted their lives to. Like, in some sense, they're really committed to this, but in another sense, all they do is attend staff meetings and grade papers, try to invigilate exams and punish students for cheating. And they're often forced to teach courses that have nothing to do with their own area of so-called expertise. So anyway, I just say that's a very different cycle to get trapped in. Once, when I was in Laos, so this is Vientiane, the capital city of Laos, I spoke to a white Canadian couple. They were not a romantic couple, but they were a man and a woman traveling together as tourists. I talked to this couple about Haiti, about the politics of Haiti. And the male tourist, the male of the two, he said to me in this sort of heavy voice, he said, "Yeah, especially lately." And I looked at him with real surprise. So I'm living in this third world country with limited access to the internet and no access to newspapers or conventional kind of updates about the outside world. So I look at him and say, "What do you mean lately?" Like, I'm thinking, what has there been another riot in Haiti? Has there been another revolution in Haiti? Like, has there been another earthquake in Haiti? What disaster has befallen Haiti now? And anyway, he picks up on the nuance and the insinuation of what I'm saying, and he just looks at me with sort of sad expression. He says, "Oh no, I just mean the last few years." I say to him, "Lately? What do you mean lately? It's been hard for 400 years. It's been a disaster for 400 years. Like, that's what we're talking about here. I don't know what you mean about lately." In the English language, words like revolution and independence are presumed to have positive connotations. We talk about revolution in Haiti in terms of its positive effects only. We talk about independence in Haiti in terms of the positive effects only. Nobody wants to think through the potential for revolutionary failure. Nobody wants to think through the extent to which Haiti would be better off today without that revolution, without independence, if Haiti had continued to be a French colony down to the year 2026. It seems immoral. It seems mildly horrifying to question the revolution. And we talk about revolution exclusively in terms of benefits, not drawbacks, not disadvantages. Now, let me just repeat this very briefly about the United States of America. The American Revolution, American independence. Do you ever hear anyone conceptualizing the disadvantages of the revolution, the drawbacks of, the failures of independence, the way in which America is a worse place today, and the way in which the whole world is worse off because of the American Revolution, because of American independence? The way in which the American Revolution created a false model for Republican government, for empire, for democracy, for independence, even economically. The way in which this really was worse than the European management of colonies along the East Coast of that continent. The American Revolution, right away, you can talk about a whole list of people, of categories of people for whom life was worse after the American Revolution, including, in case you didn't know, the indigenous people. If you just stop and reflect on it, those of you who are familiar with the history, there are many, many ways in which even the American Revolution has to be looked at as a disaster. The revolution in Haiti, more so. But we all romanticize revolution as such. We think of revolution only and exclusively in terms of what is advantageous about it, so on and so forth for this word independence. Civil war. Civil war is thought about negatively. But we don't say the American Civil War. We don't say the French Civil War. We say the American Revolution. We say the French Revolution. The English Civil War. For some reason, we call that the English Civil War, not the English Revolution. It was both. All the examples were both. Haiti was also a civil war. I mean, it's you could call it the Haitian Civil War instead of the Haitian Revolution. It was both. There was a revolution. There was also a civil war. all these examples, right? Some of you will recall a few months ago, I entertained this discussion of the politics of Hungary. I was considering learning Hungarian as a language. I'm currently a bit more tempted by Russian as a language, but yeah, I've been considering learning Hungarian, learning Russian, learning Romanian too. Not worth digressing why. Obviously, I'm tempted by ancient Latin. Different sort of temptation. In the video I made talking about the politics of Hungary, it's on YouTube, I point out that Hungarians had this delusion that if they imitated American democracy, they would rapidly ascend to having the same quality of living that they saw in Vienna, Austria. That they would become a wealthy, successful Western European capitalist democracy comparable to Vienna, comparable to Berlin, in some ways comparable to the most beautiful parts of France. We could say the south of France. Hungarians do tend to visit Vienna and compare themselves to the Viennese, especially. When they think of normality, they're probably not thinking about Spain, and they're probably not thinking about England, Vienna, and Berlin, the most immediate examples. Anyway, the Hungarians are just mystified. They signed up for neoliberalism. They signed up for this hodgepodge of policies imitating the United States of America. And what do they end up with? They perceive their own country as a disaster, as a failure. When I talk to Hungarians, I say, oh, well, why don't you compare yourselves to the Serbs? Why don't you look at Serbia and how that turned out? Why don't you compare yourselves to, former Yugoslavia? And then you think, hey, it's not so bad. Hey, like Hungary isn't such a failure when you make the comparison. And they are shocked. Hungarians, they gasp for breath when I say that. And what they've said back to me is they never think about that. They're like, no, we never compare ourselves to Serbia or former Yugoslavia. We don't think that way. That's an instructive moment. Talk about anthropology. Talk about, participant observation. You're never going to get that through the written word. You have to have those conversations verbally to see and hear that, feel that. Oh, wow. Okay, this comparison to Serbia. What a shocking suggestion that compliance with the neoliberal world order and the imitation of the United States of America would lead to a situation like Serbia is now in. If you sign up for this program, that's what you're going to get. Now, in my video, I talk about other aspects of neoliberalism, such as 10% of the population in your major cities being Muslim. This is what multiculturalism means in practice. Just like Paris, you're going to have a massive Muslim community living there. If you imitate Paris, you end up with certain aspects of culture in Paris. What about Mexico? What about Haiti? Okay, you Hungarians are new to this game. You stopped imitating Moscow. Now you're imitating Washington, D.C. Guess what? The Mexicans are way ahead of you. The Mexicans have so much more experience with the Washington Consensus. The Mexicans have so much more experience with neoliberalism. See where it got them. Mexico is a disaster. Mexico is a failure. Next level, Haiti. I'm not going to try to recapitulate the history of Haiti, but if you don't know, American military intervention in Haiti actually set up a government not by the people, of the people, for the people. They set up a government by the U.S. Marine Corps, of the U.S. Marine Corps, and for the U.S. Marine Corps. Haiti was ruled by an American military junta, an American government of occupation. They were specifically U.S. Marine Corps guys. Now, just being real with you, maybe people in Haiti today look back on that period of their history and say, oh, that wasn't so bad. Because afterwards, everything got worse. I've certainly met and spoken to people who lived in Haiti who now look back at the dictatorship of Papa Doc Duvalier and his son, Papa Doc and Baby Doc. They look back at the Duvalier period of their history as if it were a golden age. At the time, people talked about it as if Duvalier were Hitler. People looked at it as a totally immoral, brutal regime, well, afterwards things got worse. My point is, Mexico imitated America. Haiti imitated America, right? What does the imitation of American policies under neoliberalism lead to? Hungarians could have figured this out. They didn't. They're still shocked. They're still in a state of disbelief. And I do think their misperception of it is fundamentally racist. Like, they fundamentally feel there's something intrinsic to the Hungarian character, the Hungarian spirit, that means they won't end up like the Mexicans, they won't end up like the Haitians, and even, as I mentioned, they won't end up like the Yugoslavians, they won't end up like the Serbians. Imitating the same set of policies, taking the same political principles, and putting them into practice, institutionalizing them in exactly the same way. And guess what? You're not special. Imitating these principles has been a disaster everywhere. I live on the east coast of Canada. Life here is not worth living. During the coronavirus years, I was on the west coast of Canada. Life there is not worth living. Not for anyone. Not for the rich, not for the poor, not for the middle class. And this is reflected in the decision people make again and again and again, not to have children. The failure of this civilization is profound, but it is reflected in, it is demonstrated by, it can be measured through things that are shallow. That's the way political science works. The scientific aspect is looking for these shallow indications of more profound philosophical problems. That's kind of what we do in political science. But okay, you have this massively illiterate, intellectually unsophisticated, multicultural society with drug addiction at epidemic levels, right? Nobody can afford to own a home. Nobody has any optimism about the future. And there is this tremendous cultural shallowness to the place, which is in large part a result of our own history of genocide, cultural genocide as well as just literal genocide, the absence of the indigenous people here. And it's in part, you could say, a result of the rise and fall of Christianity in our civilization. I am an atheist. I'm a nihilistic atheist. But I wouldn't just talk about the failure of Christianity, the hollowness of Christianity, the falsity of Christianity. You also have to recognize Christianity had its successes. It had its own philosophy. It had its own truth. But today, right, we're looking back on that as failure. It's false now. Okay, and this contributes to this crisis. Cultural crisis, civilizational crisis. I have a friend in Israel. I think right now I have 2 friends in Israel, so I don't have a lot of friends in Israel. I would like to have more friends in Israel. So if any of my fans are in Israel, hit me up. One of my books is being translated into Hebrew right now. It's going to be published on Amazon, or pseudo-published, in Hebrew, English, and Russian, trilingual. So maybe I can make some more friends in Israel. All right. And I have a friend in Israel. And I said to him, look, you have lived in Italy. You have lived in Athens, Greece. He's also lived in Ireland. He's spent some time in France and Germany. I said to him, look, if you return to Israel, he has returned to Israel. He's living in Israel now, by the way, again. Okay, you're born and raised in Israel. If you go and live in Italy for a period of time, and you say, hey, this is civilization. This is democracy. This is, this is living. Okay? And then you go back to Israel and say, it's just not the same. We have to struggle to catch up with Italy. I get you. I understand. I relate. If you spend time in Athens, he also spent time in Cyprus, and you feel that that was paradise, that was something wonderful, and now Israel has to change, you're dissatisfied with life in Israel and democracy in Israel. You're dissatisfied with atheism in Israel. Like, you're dissatisfied with the religious and cultural situation. You're dissatisfied with the intellectual reality of political life in Israel, the intellectual caliber of Israeli politics. And you say, hey, there's something special about life in Greece or Italy or Cyprus or whatever. Okay, I understand. I understand. Now, that can be the beginning of a long conversation. It doesn't have to be the end. I understand. If you left Israel and you went to Los Angeles and you feel this way, I don't understand. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I don't know how anyone can visit Los Angeles and then go back to Israel and say, wow, Los Angeles represents a refined civilization that we have to catch up with. Wow, the level of intellectual sophistication. I cannot relate. If you go to Manhattan Island, so downtown New York, and then you go back to Israel, life in New York is not worth living. Life in Los Angeles is not worth living. And when you get outside of those big tourist destinations, it only gets worse. I am not going to romanticize life in the Ozark Mountains, rural, small town, United States of America. Whether you're talking about a visitor from Israel, or you're talking about a visitor from Hungary, or you're talking about a visitor from Iran, it's just not the case that the American model is some kind of self-evident success that is going to inspire people to imitate it. I met Communist Party officials in Laos. This was in Vientiane. I also spent time in remote areas where people were starving. I spent time in poverty-stricken villages, but that's not what's in the capital city. I met Lao government officials who had visited Los Angeles, who had visited New York, paid for by the American government. And they came back and said, I can't believe the poverty. I can't believe the drug addiction. I can't believe it's a disaster. The impression the United States of America made on them was that when they visit a bus station in America, it's worse than Laos, it's worse than China, right? These people knew what cities in communist China were like. It's next door. It's worse than Thailand. They visit America and they say, this is a disaster. They visit university campuses in America and they say, this is a disaster. We don't want this. And again, they'll know some universities, China, Thailand, their own country, and a lot of these people had visited Japan. You know, and some of them openly said that. Like, why would we choose America as a model to imitate or emulate? We've been to Japan. We've seen some other approach to these questions, to these problems. Now, I also think it's to the credit of the Americans that they're not hiding the problems. When they bring over dignitaries from Laos and Cambodia and so on, you know, that these people really do, you know, get to see the brutal reality of what America is, what it's become. The belief in revolution as something intrinsically positive, the belief in independence as something intrinsically positive, parallels and prefigures the belief in peaceful protest. It parallels and prefigures. What do I mean? We're prepared to believe in peaceful protest as this engine of social and political change by our shallow study of the history of revolutions and independence movements. One prepares us for the other. We all start studying political history as children. We're given a lot of propaganda. One prefigures the other. We are told that peaceful protest has all of the benefits of revolution while killing very few people, or perhaps killing none at all. Whatever it was that was supposedly good about revolutionary movements, about independence movements, is now supposedly accomplished through non-violent, peaceful protest. Nobody has actually read Mohandas Gandhi's book, Nonviolence in Peace and War. It comes in 2 volumes. You better include the second volume in your reading of that, because in volume 2, he says that he was wrong about many of the things he said in volume 1. Lost in this analysis is the significance of civil war. Whether or not peaceful protest can accomplish the same things, can accomplish the same benefits as a revolution or an independence movement, do you believe peaceful protest can accomplish the same things as a civil war? Today is January 20th, 2026. Back on January 12th, I posted to my blog and also posted to Patreon a sort of article titled, Iran, I am not opposed to civil war. I am opposed to pretending that peaceful protest can accomplish the same things as a civil war. Now, I've been very, very sick. I've had coronavirus repeatedly. I had surgery. I'm still struggling to recover from the surgery. The knock-on effects of the surgery include a lot of problems with digestion. And I've had spinal injuries. So I've really had periods of time where I can't walk. But most recently, I got coronavirus twice within a month, 2 different strains. So I got coronavirus, I recovered from coronavirus, and then I got coronavirus again. It's been very, very tough. So I haven't spoken about this earlier because I have been so sick. The reason why this is recorded as audio only is that I still am sick. I'm quite sick and exhausted. So you get me on the microphone and not on camera. But back on the 12th, just read you this portion of the article. It's me talking to an Iranian member of the audience. I wonder what he would say today, because the perspective on the conflict in Iran has already changed so much. I say to him in reply, quote, I have been very sick, but when I'm healthy enough to get on camera, I'll record a further video about this, meaning Iran, the peaceful protests in Iran, blah, blah, blah. Protests that at that time had already killed hundreds of people. Today, supposedly, thousands of people have died. Okay? I continue. Quote, I am not opposed to civil war. I am opposed to pretending that peaceful protests can accomplish the same things as civil war. And I am opposed to delusional optimism about the body count entailed by a civil war. And I am cautioning the audience, in parallel to Syria, as to just how undemocratic and unsecular the outcomes of the civil war may be. This video is less than 3 minutes long. It's a video I made at the time. It leaves many things unsaid. To have a government in Iran that forces the population to accept, 1, the theory of evolution, and 2, the workplace equality of women and overt homosexuals. What would be the body count for that? What would be a realistic estimate of how much violence would be required to bring about that social transformation? The French Revolution was reversible. Many of those people died fighting for the future of an illusion, although for a few short years, it seemed to be real.
Many years ago, when the so-called Arab Spring gave way to outright civil war in Syria, I remember a man saying, passionately, in an interview with news reporters, well, so what if 50,000 people have to die to achieve democracy in Syria? How many people died to create democracy in the United States of America? Now, it has to come at a price, has to come with a body count. It can only be produced by struggle. All right? Now, obviously, I'm embellishing what this guy said and the way in which he said it. English was his second language, and he was not a political scientist. He was not a political philosopher. And I broke down weeping. I really cried. And as the tears rolled down my face, I knew with great bitterness it wouldn't be 50,000 that died, and it wouldn't be 100,000 that died. No, no, no. More than 1 million could die in Syria without creating democracy. And here we are, more than 500,000 in Syria died, and they didn't end up with democracy. They ended up merely making the transition from an anti-American Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship to a pro-American Islamic fundamentalist dictatorship. They now have a Muslim dictatorship ruling the country that cooperates with the United States of America instead of endlessly antagonizing it. Well, the body count just came in from Iran of 500 people, 500 peaceful protesters dead in the streets. Do you want to talk about what it would take to achieve a secular, scientific, modern democracy in Iran? Is it 50,000? Is it 500,000? Is it a body count numbered in the millions?
When I recorded the 3-minute video reflecting on the would-be revolution in Iran, reflecting on the peaceful protests in Iran, everyone disagreed with pardon me. Everyone disagreed with me. What I had to say seemed shocking and unpopular. Just a few days later, everyone agrees with me. The agreement is just as shallow and ignorant as the disagreement. I take no joy in it. There's no joy for me in being right about this. But my pessimism has been vindicated. The warning I offered has proven to be prescient and sagacious. For just a few short days, there was this irrational optimism about the peaceful protests in Iran. And what I am suggesting to you now is that this is based on a sort of twofold misconception, or, one illusion exacerbating another. The first illusion conflates peaceful protests with revolution. And the second conflates revolution with civil war. What you want can only be achieved through war, not peace. My verbiage here reflects both the sanity and the insanity of Mohandas Gandhi. Many people call him Mahatma Gandhi, not me. All right. Gandhi's claim was that nonviolence could provide you with the same social benefits of war. He really uses that kind of reasoning, and it reflects the uniquely Indian experience of the 20th century. They talked a lot about the benefits of war. Yeah, you can say this is linked to different aspects of Hinduism as a religious and cultural tradition. Yeah. But it also reflects the Indian experience just with World War I and World War II. They were involved in those wars from afar. They were incorporated into the British Empire during those wars, but their experience of the war was very different from Poland. Very simply, in Volume 1 of Nonviolence and Peace and War, Gandhi presents the theory that when you have overwhelming power, when you have the power to win through violence, but you demonstrate that you're going to hold back, you demonstrate that you can conquer the other side, you can master the other side, but you're not going to. Okay, that's his model of the nonviolence of the strong. He criticizes and condemns the nonviolence of the weak, which is begging. Okay? So he says, look, we're not begging. We're demonstrating we have the power to win through violence, and then we're choosing not to use violence. That's his model in Volume 1. And in Volume 2, he regrets everything. He says he realizes now that what he thought was the nonviolence of the strong was in fact the nonviolence of the weak. He says it would have been 10,000 times better to have war, to have civil war, than the nonviolence of the weak. Now, Gandhi was insane. He was very stupid and very ignorant and very insane. But he's not totally insane. I mean, even in what I just told you, the fact that he later regretted, like in Volume 2, he regrets and reconsiders things he said in Volume 1. Well, there's a little bit of sanity in there. There's a little bit of humanity, a little bit of humility, too. There's something worth talking about. This is parallel to what I told you about Tucker Carlson about an hour ago. I said, look, I despise Tucker Carlson and I think he's insane, but at least Tucker Carlson today can look back on things he said in the past and admit that he regrets them, admit that he was wrong. Out of this peculiar culture we have of valorizing peaceful protest, regarding peaceful protest as an efficacious substitute for revolution, an efficacious substitute for civil war, about which I'll say more in just a moment. We have this misconception that the collapse of an evil regime is inevitable, and that the improvement of these regimes is inevitable. So there's a false inevitability of collapse, false inevitability of improvement. It is just a matter of time. That's the delusion. Talking about efficacy is ever so slightly taboo in politics, in political philosophy, in philosophy as such. We have this very vaguely stated tradition in the West, in Europe, of pretending that questions of efficacy, questions of expediency, are contrary to and incompatible with questions of morality. This is ridiculous, but I see the sense in which it's appealing. During my own lifetime, Jordan Peterson has gotten on stage again and again and said, you cannot conceptualize these problems in your life in terms of doing what is expedient. You have to think about what's moral, what's right. Now, to what extent is this tradition rooted in Aristotle? To what extent is it rooted in Catholic or Protestant preachers from the centuries in between Aristotle and the present day? In this podcast, we're not going to get into it. To what extent is this a sort of response to the oversized influence of utilitarianism in our times? Utilitarianism and consequentialism. There are questions to be asked here. Efficacy, when it's included in the equation, changes everything. Is it moral or immoral to give someone a pill and promise them that this pill will transform them from a man into a woman? Well, what if the pill worked? What if we were living in a very different universe, a parallel universe where the laws of physics were different, the laws of chemistry were different? What if we really had this technology, a pill that in a period of 3 months would regenerate someone's entire body so that the man actually became a woman? He actually became capable of having a baby. He menstruated, everything. Every cell in the male body regenerated, maintained the same continuum of consciousness, the same mind, the same personality, but his body was, in this sense, truly transformed. The ethical questions, the political questions about transgender hormone therapy would be different. Now, let me just add on, what if there was a pill you could take at any time that would miraculously have the reverse effect? So everyone on Earth could, at liberty, with no side effects, no personal harm to their health, could take a pill and after 3 months try being the opposite gender, and then they could take another pill and transition back with absolutely zero enfeebling effects, zero mental side effects, zero physical side effects. That kind of efficacy would change the ethical questions involved. They would change the political questions involved. Obviously, but we're trained not to think about politics in this way. We're trained to set questions of efficacy aside because what is expedient supposedly is immoral or is incompatible with moral reasoning, moral thinking. Every single one of you has had a friend take antidepressant medication. If you haven't had that experience, you ain't got no friends. Half of you have taken antidepressant medications yourself. Well, what if we were living in a parallel universe where the pills worked? What if there were miserable people in Saudi Arabia, there were miserable people in Iran who said, hey, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in this oppressive regime, I don't believe in this religion that justifies the regime, I'm miserable, but I take this pill and it makes me happy. What if like 50% of the population in each one of these countries took these pills that just miraculously made them happy all the time, no matter how miserable their conditions were? That would lead to different ethical questions, different political questions, different philosophical questions. What if these pills worked so well that everyone in prison was happy? So you'd have the mother of a murdered child saying, hey, this isn't fair. We sent this guy to prison so he'd be miserable and suffer. As soon as he goes to prison, he takes these pills, and the pills are so efficacious. The pills are so expedient. The pills really work, and now he's happy all the time. He's happier in prison than before he went to prison. He's happier inside the prison walls than he was when he was free because he takes these pills, and the pills really work. So on some level, our whole political discourse about antidepressants, about psych meds, it's cynical. It's actually based on the assumption that the pills don't work. The drugs don't work. They have terrible side effects, and the positive effect is either zero or it's so tiny it can barely be measured scientifically. I made many YouTube videos about this in the past. Those YouTube videos impacted various people's lives profoundly. Okay, my point here is, this is the law of threes, people, okay? Just like in comedy writing, we've had the two examples leading up to it. Here's that third beat. American military intervention, American regime change. What if it really worked? What if it created one utopia after another? What if there was this amazing record of American military intervention creating a paradise that Americans would want to visit on their vacation, where Americans were jealous? Americans would go to Afghanistan on vacation and say, hey, this is crazy. I don't want to live in Florida anymore. I don't want to live in California. And maybe they even feel resentful. They say, look, I thought the point was to punish Afghanistan. I thought the point was to get revenge on Afghanistan. And instead, you've turned Afghanistan into an earthly paradise. Exactly the same question must be asked about communist colonization, communist wars of occupation. Indeed, even the communist conquest of Afghanistan, I think the history of Yemen would be an even better example. We would be asking very different questions today if it worked. The morality and the political science of these drugs, we have to talk about efficacy. We have to talk about expediency. The morality of peaceful protests in the streets, the political philosophy, the morality of armed intervention, occupation, regime change. We cannot question these things without explicitly acknowledging the too often implicit problem of efficacy, of whether or not it works.
How long can North Korea last? How long can Saudi Arabia last? How long did Mongolian tyranny last? The empire built by Genghis Khan. There's this image in Buddhist philosophy of a wooden wheel rolling down a hill. And if you haven't seen this, you haven't experienced this in real life, this image may not mean as much to you as it does to me. But a handmade wheel, a wooden wheel, an old-fashioned wheel, it can roll down a dirt path for an incredible length of time. Like, you think it's going to topple and fall over, but you end up running after it as it rolls down the street, and it keeps going. If you take the wheel off your bicycle to repair something, and then it gets away from you, it starts rolling down the street, you might expect it to flop over. Maybe 9 times out of 10, it flops over after a short distance, but it can keep rolling down the street a long, long way, and now you're running down the street trying to get your wheel back. Or you just sit there and watch it go, and you're like, wow, that rolled a long way. The point is, it could teeter and topple over at any time, but on the other hand, arbitrarily, it can keep going for an incredibly long period of time. Now, actually, in the political philosophy of ancient China, you do get this same argument, but not this same idiom, not this same poetic image. It's actually quite important in terms of the pre-Han period, the mythified early period. The point being, yeah, one dynasty can last for many centuries, but sometimes it's just one father and his son. There's one emperor who's wise, his immediate son is a fool, and that's it. That's the end of the emperor. You get a lot of folks in that. I've already digressed to mention how bad my own health is lately. I'm now 47 years old, and women still find me handsome. Some of these women just want to sleep with me, but some of these women are really talking to me about getting married and having a baby. Like they're looking for a serious commitment relationship just based on my appearance. Just based on my physical appearance at 47. So like a wooden wheel rolling down a hill, how long is that going to last? You know, I don't think I'm delusional about my looks. Without digressing into how ugly I am, within the last year, I've been in and out of the hospital. I almost died, or you could say I did die and came back from the dead. Matter of perspective. I've been very weak. I've been very sick. Again, I had spinal injuries too. And these beautiful women are coming up to me and really trying to initiate relationships. Okay, like, look, how long is that going to last? I had a friend. She was vegan. She was sober. And she was still really attractive at 41. And everyone commented on it. Everyone said to her, like, wow, they flattered her in different ways, but people really said, hey, you're still really cute in your 40s. I had one male friend. He was more than half her age, but I don't know. He was much younger than her. And I remember he was really seriously trying to flirt with her. He would have gotten married or whatever. And I remember saying to him, okay, you sure? You sure you can make a lifelong commitment to this woman who's so much older than you are? Yeah. Didn't work out. It didn't work out. But, again, as the wheel rolls down the hill, she lost her looks quite soon after that. 42 or 43, something like that. Let's say when she was 43, she'd really lost her looks entirely. I don't know why. And there may be no reason why. It can just be the passage of time. Just be, yeah, you were gorgeous at 41. At 43, you're ugly. I'm not going to digress here into the life of the mind. Let me tell you something. The only thing that lasts. It's the only thing that lasts, Scarlett. I'm talking to Scarlett O'Hara here. The only thing that lasts is the life of the mind, okay? What you've got to build up that's really going to be meaningful and rewarding you in old age is not the life of the body. It's the life of the mind. But I just say, I live with this uncertainty. I always have. There are people who knew me in high school who heard me talking about this. There are people who knew me, in my BA in university who heard me talking about this. I used to always warn people, old age and death are coming. Disability could be just down the road. Before I went to Cambodia and Laos, I was still in Toronto, I'm still doing my BA, whatever. I said to people, including my professors, but other students, look, I got to go out and walk in between the landmines now. because I don't know how much longer I'm going to be walking for. At some point, you are stuck at a desk with your books. At some point, disability, illness, injury catches up with you. You can't play Major League Hockey forever. You have just a few years where you're strong enough to be in these competitive sports. But I really wanted to get out and do the sort of social anthropology side of my research while I was young and strong. I didn't want to get into a PhD program and then try to take those risks afterwards. Look, I have the physical strength and stamina now, so I've got to do this while my vitality lasts. That was my perspective already in high school. I was really aware of how fleeting health and beauty can be. The opposite can also be true. You can find yourself at age 47 and you're still attractive to 25-year-old women. And you didn't plan on that, and you didn't expect it, and you didn't even earn it. I can't really say it's because of my hard work that, this is my situation in life. I can't say I earned it. I cannot say that. I've had times I'm not going to the gym at all. I've had times where I can barely walk. I'm in and out of the hospital, and these women are still trying to get with me. That's my experience in life. Am I going to tell you it's because of virtue? Am I going to tell you it's because of luck? Yes, I am intentionally construing this in parallel to the regime in Iran. How long can the regime in Iran last? How long can the regime in Myanmar last? Once that wooden wheel starts rolling down the hill, you don't know. It can wobble and fall over at any time. But on the other hand, it can keep rolling for an unbelievably long period of time. Seemingly impossible. Seemingly in defiance of the laws of physics, but in fact, in perfect conformity to the laws of physics. That's what you're looking at with every wobble of the wheel, and on some level, you know it. Ancient China, and most of what we have from ancient China, it's from several centuries later, looking back. Same thing with Rome, actually. A lot of the sources we have from Rome are a couple centuries after the events being described, looking back on them and evaluating them. The Chinese are aware of how arbitrary and how unstable their political systems have been. They are aware that what you're talking about here is not the difference between good and evil. It's not the difference between right and wrong. When I am reading Appian in his history of the civil wars, so these are the civil wars in Italy, in Rome, that ensued after the death of Julius Caesar. Does Appian actually believe that one side of the Civil War represents democracy and the other side represents tyranny? No, never. To ask this kind of question about the history of China is even more surreal. But of course, now, in the present tense, we really are this ignorant. We really are this stupid in looking at the history of Syria, in looking at the history of Libya, in looking at the history of Afghanistan, in looking at the history of Iran. We want to construe this in a simple sense, as if one side of the argument is pro-democracy, as if one side is good and the other side is evil. And that is just flagrantly not the case. If you're hearing this podcast the same day it's uploaded, we all just lived through this, right? We all just lived through a wave of propaganda making moralistic claims about the would-be revolutionaries in Iran, people who were so foolish and idealistic as to think that peaceful protest resulting in the deaths of many hundreds of people, now it's estimated many thousands of people, okay, that this would bring about the same positive outcomes as a revolution and a civil war. Okay. And I cautioned this could instead have the same kind of outcomes that we just saw in Syria. And I challenged my viewer, my reader, my Iranian fan who was writing back and forth to me. I said, okay, what would it take to have a school system that coercively forces the people of Iran to accept the theory of evolution, to accept the workplace equality of women and overt homosexuals. That's a very different question from what percentage of people would like to see the king of Iran restored, would like to see a monarchy instead of the current self-styled Islamic Republic, self-styled revolutionary government. Now, I am aware the theory of evolution and democracy are two different things. Gender equality, or even gender equity, and democracy, two different things, three different things. These are different things. The status of homosexuals in society and democracy, two very different things. You can certainly have a homophobic democracy. I'm asking a different question that forces the other side, forces the optimist about public protest to recognize the absurdity of his own claims. The people in the streets of Iran who are complaining that the cost of living is too high, in some cases the cost of food is too high. There's a specific instance where it's the cost of bicycles is too high. They're complaining about the general breakdown of the economy. Those people are not fighting for a future in which prostitution is legal, tolerated, and ubiquitous. They're not fighting for the sexual liberation of women and gay men. They are not fighting for a future in which Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is coercively taught to the masses and accepted by the masses. Now, guess what? As soon as you accept Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, you have to reflect on the extent to which your whole society in Iran has been destroyed by inbreeding. And it's a long-term problem. You can look up right now very easily what percentage of the population of Iran is the product of cousin marriage. The statistic that's easy to get, I will warn you, just looks at a single stage of inbreeding. It just examines one marriage at one time. What really matters is looking at several successive generations of inbreeding. The problem is not just that one man marries his cousin once and produces one child. The harder statistic to get is to look at that child and say, okay, over the last 10 generations, how many grandparents and great-grandparents were marrying their cousins? And it's first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. They all matter. It's all inbreeding. Iran, right now, has one of the greatest genetic crises in the history of the world. It's not just that they're one of the worst examples that exists in the world today. They are one of the worst examples that ever has existed. Now, I am morally opposed to slavery, and it's necessary for me to preface what I'm about to say with that disclaimer. I am morally opposed to slavery. I'm also politically opposed to slavery. However, if you have a culture that encourages cousin marriage, but at the same time it also encourages going to war, enslaving others, and then sexually reproducing with the slaves, those slaves that are conquered and so on, those people are not your cousins. Those people at least are significantly genetically different from yourself. So during long centuries of that kind of slave economy, centuries and millennia, that did counterbalance cousin marriage. And we've now had a few centuries of stability and peace, and slavery has been at first discouraged and then eventually made illegal. So unfortunately, in a culture like Iran, that means the genetic consequences of inbreeding, the genetic consequences of the culture of cousin marriage have gotten worse, not better. The implications of the theory of evolution, they can be deeply disturbing and shocking Western Europe has its own history of social Darwinism, has its own history of eugenics, and then responses to, reactions to those theories, those philosophies, those views of the world. The theory of evolution, understanding it, internalizing it, culturally responding to it, it's a major step forward in each and every society. And it may be that you take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. It may be that you really struggle with this. So for Iran, that is not going to be a minor or subtle cultural change where people really recognize, hey, we are all just a bunch of monkeys. And then guess what? For the Iranians, specifically and especially, there is this terrible poison pill to deal with, the consequences of cousin marriage, the consequences of inbreeding, and what we're going to do about it. Very brief comparative mention. Iceland has to deal with this, right? The people of Iceland, compared to the Iranians, are all atheists. I'm saying that in a jocular way. Obviously, many people in Iceland are still Christians. I'm sure many people in Iceland still pray and still go to church. But the degree of religiosity, the depth of their faith is so much less than the people of Iran that, people in Iceland who call themselves Christians would seem to be atheists when compared to the Iranians. But this is something Iceland has to cope with. I know they have a database, and university students would sign up for it to avoid falling in love with their own cousins. Because in Iceland, you can go to university, you meet someone, you don't know them, and it leads to pregnancy and marriage or what have you. And in fact, that person is your cousin, you didn't realize it. So Iceland is trying to get organized and trying to cope with this. I don't know. I don't know what they'll do. But obviously, the Icelandic people can deal with that. They've reached a certain level of scientific, secular detachment about these things. The people of Iran have not. I just want to return to this concept. The false inevitability of collapse, the false inevitability of improvement. So it's not inevitable that the regime in Iran will collapse. It's not inevitable that this collapse would be an improvement. Referring back to what I said an hour ago, we really can examine the history of Haiti and the extent to which the revolution made everything worse, the extent to which independence made everything worse. We can examine the American Revolution, the extent to which it made everything worse. I'm very serious about that. Far be it from me to suggest that Myanmar would be better off today if it had continued to be a British colony. I mean, Myanmar is such a disaster. Does anyone even doubt that? That Myanmar would be better off if it had continued to be a colony of the United Kingdom? 20th century. How about Hong Kong? What a shocking suggestion that Hong Kong would be better off today as a British-controlled democracy instead of a Chinese-controlled dictatorship. Shocking, horrifying. Who can question the value of revolution? Who can question the value of independence? Are the people of Hong Kong proud of their independence? They're no longer dependent upon the British Empire. Quite a question to ask. This false inevitability, why is it that we are so reluctant to ask? What are the factors that would make improvement inevitable? What are the factors that would make the collapse of a tyranny inevitable? This is the first time in this recording where I reveal my real agenda. We don't want to talk this through because it's humbling. We don't want to talk this through because it's humiliating to all of us, not just in terms of nationalistic propaganda. Improving the intellectual quality of the population en masse would make improvement inevitable. Improving the intellectual quality of a small elite would only make improvement inevitable if that elite becomes armed and then leads some kind of revolution, some kind of civil war. Those are the two and only two paths to improvement. Whether we are talking about Iran or China or Myanmar or Canada or the United States or England. Now, I'm going to digress. This is a very different kind of problem, but it is attached to exactly the same solution. How can you achieve a government in England, in Canada, in the United States? How can you achieve a government that truly understands global warming and commits to take the steps necessary to reverse global warming? It's a different problem from democracy in Iran. It's a different problem from democracy in Myanmar. But it's exactly the same solution. We can only get there either by improving the intellectual quality of the people, meaning the masses, meaning everybody or the majority, or you produce an elite, whether that's 10% of the population or 5% of the population, you produce an elite group that's at a much higher level of intellectual sophistication, and then they take over through force. That may be in part a revolution, but it will definitely be in part a civil war, whether or not you want to call it a civil war. So if you have an enlightened minority that fights for the future, that wants to deal with global warming, that will entail a fight in the most literal sense of the term. That will entail combat, because the majority repudiates their legitimacy as a regime. They don't accept being tyrannically ruled by these people. There is a cultural difference between the average Texan and the enlightened minority I'm alluding to. The average person in Texas and their attitude towards cattle and beef and the oil industry, contrast that to the culture of this imaginary elite that really understands the significance of global warming and wants to do something about it. This is a cultural difference. This is a fissure between two segments of the population. Okay, well, guess what? In Iran, you have an elite. This is not connected to education. You can grow up as a peasant, and be a part of this elite. You have an elite that understands the extent to which the national religion is bullshit. And what kind of society does this elite want to live in? They want to live in a society that will, in the eyes of the majority, condemn them to go to hell after they die. They want to live in a society where women and gay men have the freedom to prostitute themselves. You cannot exaggerate the significance of the sexual component of this problem. Because, as I said in just a single sentence of my very brief book, Blood in the Snow, all political organization is in principle sexual. What we're talking about here is not symbolically sexual, like a dildo. It is actually sexual, like a bird's nest. I understand the sense in which a dildo is erotic, but this is only because it appeals to the imagination of a heterosexual woman or a homosexual man. It symbolizes something sexual. The bird's nest is the actual bridge between generations. When we organize politically, whether that's part of a status quo regime or it's a revolutionary civil war, we are building the bird's nest. When we build the institutions, schools, hospitals, when we build roads, the roads that we scatter across the landscape are so many twigs in this bird's nest. We are building the society for our children and grandchildren to live in. We are creating the conditions that will allow us to sexually reproduce. And from the perspective of conservative Muslims, when they are repressing homosexuality, when they are repressing prostitution, making prostitution illegal, making it invisible, but possibly putting people in prison, possibly executing people, what have you, from their perspective, they are likewise building that bird's nest. They are building the bridge between generations. All political organization is sexual in principle. Political philosophy is erotic, period.
We do this for our children and grandchildren. We don't do it for ourselves. That's why it's political. If you just want to sit in your backyard and paint a picture of the sunset, it's not political. What we're talking about in this podcast is political, therefore sexual, therefore erotic, in a very different way. And we have to move past symbolic reasoning. Okay? The debate about the future of Iran. One side will say they represent freedom. What do you mean by freedom? You mean prostitution. You mean having a society of whores. You mean having a society that resembles Las Vegas instead of a society that resembles Saudi Arabia. You can call it freedom. That is an abstraction. That is symbolic reasoning. Prostitution is something real. There are boys who lose their virginity in high school by paying a prostitute. If that is legal, it will be actual. The boy who is the paying client is going to be psychologically damaged by this for the rest of his life. He's going to be intellectually damaged by this. He's going to be morally damaged by this. He's probably going to be aesthetically damaged by this. And I have known a small number of men who were honest with me about this. I'm remembering one guy in particular who really talked about how he lost his virginity having sex with prostitutes. Now the thing, but I'm remembering two very different guys. They lost their virginity having sex with prostitutes, and it influenced everything else they did in their lives ever after. It was a big deal. And it was not the last time they slept with a prostitute. They didn't try it once and then quit. No. This had a massive corrupting effect on it. Okay, obviously, our primary preoccupation is with the moral degradation of the prostitute herself. It's with the loss of human potential for the women who enter into this profession and what the effects are on them, how it changes their personalities, so on and so forth. But obviously, we have to question the social, cultural, and political consequences of this from every angle, for everyone involved. Yes, a shockingly high percentage of prostitutes end up becoming drug addicts. What about the men who have sex with them? Men who have sex with prostitutes. Do you think they are bastions of sobriety? Do you think those are men who refuse to use cocaine? Look, there are no statistics for this. It's social science research you could do. I think most men who have been involved with prostitution for 20 years, so these are men who have been clients of prostitutes over 20 years, I think they would be willing to look back at their lives and reflect on how this became connected to their own use of drugs, including alcohol, including marijuana, but sure, including cocaine. How their choice to live their lives connected to prostitution, the negative effects it had on them in retrospect. Now, if you talk to a guy who's only 21 years old, maybe he'll be in denial about it. If you talk to a guy who's 21 and he started sleeping with prostitutes when he was 16, maybe he's still at that stage of adamantly denying that this has harmed him in any way. Right? Well, okay. So look, the transformation of society on both sides that we're discussing, it is sexual in nature. It is about building the bridge between generations. And that is why discussions about the legality of marijuana cast such a long shadow. That is why discussions about transgender hormone therapy, transgender surgery cast such a long shadow. This is about the future, not in an abstract sense, not in a symbolic sense, in a palpable, real sense. This is about biological reality, not abstract and hypothetical morality. How is anyone in Los Angeles supposed to have a child? How is anyone in Las Vegas supposed to have a child? How is anyone on Manhattan Island supposed to have and raise a child? These are horrifying places to have and raise a child. Horrifying. Nobody wants to raise their kids in that condition. Not even refugees from Iran. When I was on Manhattan Island, I was looking at these Chinese immigrants. At that time, I could still speak Chinese. I mean, I'm forgetting how to speak Chinese with every passing day, but I studied Chinese in the past. And I'm there trying to speak Chinese a little bit. You're walking around Manhattan Island, and you just think, are these people really willing to raise their kids here? I mean, are you really, like, if you're Chinese and you've either migrated here or come as a refugee, whatever your story is, really, you're really willing to commit to this? What we call freedom is a failure, is a despicable dystopia. And it's so obvious that we all ignore it. It's so obvious that life in Las Vegas is not worth living, that it is not a place you would want to have or raise children. It is so obvious that a society built around short-term sensual self-indulgence produces and is attached to a culture where life is not worth living. That short-term self-indulgence, the pursuit of happiness, becomes self-destruction. And obviously, on the other side of that equation, life in Saudi Arabia is even worse. Life in Iran is even worse. But we have to move past these abstractions. Freedom, revolution, independence, even equality, gender equality for women. Obviously, something that seems very appealing to a minority in Iran, a very small minority in Afghanistan, a minority in India, Saudi Arabia, and so on. The very first question from the other side is, are you actually going to allow women to wear bikinis at the beach? Are you actually going to allow women to film themselves naked and put it on the internet and sell it and monetize the image of their nude body? Are you actually going to allow prostitution? Yes or no? The religious people, from their perspective, they know what they're fighting for. Yes, in part, they're fighting for their immortal soul. They're fighting for the difference between going to heaven and going to hell. Fine. But even setting that aside, they are fighting for their bird's nest. They are fighting for that bridge between generations. They realize how high the stakes are. And the atheists don't. The idealists who praise democracy and freedom don't understand what they're fighting for or why. They don't understand what the struggle to live on planet Las Vegas really means. We have this word in English, illiteracy. We have this much more obscure word, innumeracy. We need a word in parallel to talk about combat illiteracy. We have to start talking about the inability to understand war, what war is, how it works, what it means, and yeah, basically, in a sense, the advantages as well as the disadvantages of war, what it is that can only be attained through warfare, and how. Whether we're talking about Israel, the conflict between Israel and Gaza, or we're talking about Iran, the first concept that the commentarial class reaches for is the concept of proportional response. And this is linked, in a way that's hard to summarize, to the culture of peaceful protest. Peaceful protest, proportional response. Wars are not won through proportional response. Wars are won through the sudden, shocking use of overwhelming force. This has been true since Napoleon. This has been true since the Stone Age. A measured proportional response, right, which is punitive in nature and is compared to policing. It's bizarre, the supposed morality of this. So, the United States of America saying, okay, well, Iran killed 800 peaceful protesters, whatever the number turns out to be. I have no idea. Again, you can look at the date on the calendar. Probably within the next few days, numbers are going to emerge from Iran. Okay, the United States decides 800 peaceful protesters were killed. Therefore, the United States of America is going to drop a certain number of bombs on strategic targets in Iran. This kind of thing. And they're going to call that a proportionate response. How did the Prussian army defeat the French? How would the people of Myanmar achieve democracy or independence? Within Myanmar, there's a discrete cultural area called Shan State. So Shan is a language, Shan is an ethnic group. If the Shan people want independence, if they want democracy, they can't achieve that through a proportionate response to what the Burmese army was doing. Parallel to the Prussians marching on Paris, they would have to organize an army that doesn't just occupy their own territory, but that marches on the major cities of Myanmar, that conquers the Burmese cities, and then forces the Burmese to sign a peace treaty, granting them independence and then granting them their own democracy. They would need a sudden, overwhelming use of force. So likewise, the people of Iran, whether we're talking about revolution or civil war, or a revolution that becomes a civil war, whether we're talking about a small minority that's intellectually more sophisticated than everyone else, or we're talking about the masses, situation where on a large scale, people have become more intellectually sophisticated, we would be talking about the sudden, violent use of force that overwhelms the old regime. We'd be talking about the conquest of the capital city at a minimum, perhaps several major cities, and that then forces that political change. What combat really means, whether we're talking about house-to-house searches, street-to-street urban combat, okay? We have a generation of people now who think about war in terms of abstractions, the language of human rights, and they do not know the reality that those abstractions serve to conceal. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a YouTube channel called à-bas-le-ciel. I have a podcast called Doom Republic. I have a number of podcasts. I have an Instagram account. I have a Patreon. And they're all linked by this catchphrase. AR+IO. Active research and informed opinion. If you want to talk to me, don't act like it's hard to find me. Tune in next week. By which time, unlike Cenk Uygur, I will have read one new book and will have had one new opinion on it, hopefully.